That's great. Thank you. Good evening, and welcome to the 10th Annual Search Seminar Lecture. Before we begin, I just want to remind people, if you would please make sure that you put your cell phones on the Do Not Disturb mode. And also, please don't actually eat snacks or anything like that during the lecture, just because it gets quite distracting. My name is Professor Scott Davidson. I'm the co-director of Alvernia University's first-year program. With me is Javier Romero. He is a first-year student here at Alvernia who has agreed to offer our mission moment. He will also help moderate the questions and answers that we will have immediately following the lecture portion of this evening's event.
Thank you. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in the giving that we receive, it is in the pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in the dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.
It is now my sincere honor to introduce you to this evening's lecturer, Dr. Janae Sholtz. Dr. Schultz is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Alvernia University. She is the coordinator of Women's and Gender Studies and an Alvernia NEAG professor. She received her PhD from the University of Memphis and MA from the New School for Social Research. She is the author of a book called The Invention of a People, Heidegger and Deleuze on Art and the Political, which was published by Edinburgh Press in 2015. She has also published the books Deleuze and the Psychoanalysis of Feminism and Italian Stoicisms from Sartre to Agamben, and numerous articles on continental philosophy, aesthetics, and feminism. Dr. Schultz is deeply committed to work that elevates issues of social justice, active and critical engagement with systems of power and oppression, feminist theory, care ethics, and exploring transformative modes of thought and practice. Please join me in expressing a warm welcome to this evening's lecturer, Dr. Janae Schultz.
Thank you, Professor Davidson, and thank you for that lovely mission moment as well. So I am here to talk about Michael Lerner's book, Revolutionary Love, a political manifesto to heal and transform the world, which is, of course, the common read for our freshman class this year. So the title of the talk is very simple. What if? The choice of this book was a response to the overwhelming sentiment that we have an ethical duty to respond to the moment in which we are living, and to the idea that we have a responsibility to address issues of ethics, not just in terms of being a good person, but in terms of making change in the world. This requires having frank discussions about the social and political issues of our time. And let's be honest, there's a lot to talk about. The willingness to venture into the fray of difficult, often contentious issues where we know we will not all share the same opinion or viewpoint is a big part of what it means to be ethical leaders with moral courage. And it's the hallmark of a liberal arts education to be exposed to a variety of ideas and perspectives, many of which you might not share or agree with. And that's okay. The point is to consider what we can learn from being presented with the unfamiliar, sometimes challenging viewpoints, and to approach ideas with the spirit of generosity and commitment to open up rather than foreclose discussion. The beauty of our search program is that you will be exposed to this book in a variety of different ways, benefiting from the specific expertise that your professors can give from their disciplinary perspectives and benefiting from the dialogue with your fellow students. It's through this exposure to others, through the diversity of opinions, that we learn to grow, that we learn to engage in the creative spirit of learning and understanding. Now, I, being a philosopher, am going to frame my discussion of the book rather philosophically. I want to focus on the overall vision and the creative, hopeful spirit of this book. My discussion will center on the concepts of value, transformation, imagination that animate Lerner's call for revolutionary love and his vision of the possibility of a caring society. As the great poet Percy Shelley said, "The great instrument of moral good is the imagination. The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our own nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person, not our own. To be greatly good, we must imagine." I don't think that we'll agree on the sole path forward, but I hope to provide some guidance through this talk about the main concerns upon which we may be able to find some common ground. So I'm going to ask you to go on a journey with me that begins with the question, what if? What if we could conceive of a different world, a different politics, a different way of valuing ourselves and society? But first, what I want to talk about is germs. The existence of microscopic organisms was discovered between 1665 and 1683. In 1665, Robert Hooke, a fellow of the Royal Society of London, presented the first published depiction of a microorganism, the microfungus mucor. And in 1670, Dutch cloth merchant Antony van Leeuwenhoek, also a fellow, looked at a drop of pond water through his homemade microscope to see microorganisms that he called animalcules. Yet it wasn't until the mid-19th century that microscopes were advanced enough to see even smaller microorganisms such as bacteria and viruses. This was what led Louis Pasteur to being able to prove that food spoiled because of contamination by invisible bacteria. Pasteur speculated that the spread of microorganisms called germs in the body could explain infectious disease, launching what is known today as germ theory. Not long after, in 1867, Joseph Lister published the article on the antiseptic principle of the practice of surgery that fundamentally changed the nature of surgery and medical hygiene, saving countless lives by eliminating the widespread infection in hospital settings. Yet, many doctors mocked the idea of invisible germs floating in the air, calling it unscientific quackery. An editor of the magazine Medical Record wrote, "We are likely to be as much ridiculed in the next century for our blind belief in the power of unseen germs as our forefathers were for their faith in the influence of spirits, of certain planets and the like, inducing certain maladies." In 1892, Max von Pettenkofer went so far as to drink a cholera cocktail to prove that the cholera bacillus alone did not cause the disease. So the basic point is that the reality of germs has not always been a well-known fact. And throughout history, there were a great many ways that people explained illness: evil spirits, angering the gods, or a god, committing a sin, or just bad air. These early germ theorists were met with derision and disbelief. The idea of microorganisms, little things floating in the air and living on the body, invisible to us, seemed, well, unbelievable. To some, impossible. And yet now we know that what was once considered impossible is possible. And this shift from the impossible to the possible is responsible for some of our most monumental breakthroughs in modern medicine. I want to pause to consider the implications of this for a moment. It seems that there is an all too human tendency to resist transformation, to resist new ideas on the basis of sticking to what we can see and touch and feel as immediately present, and realize that it takes courage, perseverance, and vision to make significant change happen. It takes a visionary approach to imagine that things might be and could be different. Additionally, it seems that we often get stuck in the mindset that there is no better way. The world is as it is, and we can't change it. There are no alternatives. That's just the way it is. This presentation is about resisting that claim. It's about asking us to consider, what if the world could be different? Revolutionary Love is a book about becoming a visionary. It asks us to think that what we may think is impossible is possible, to think about alternatives. And no, Lerner isn't a scientist. He's not proposing a new medical theory, a breakthrough in technology. Revolutionary Love is a book about breakthroughs in our way of thinking, of our consciousness. Lerner is asking us to consider transforming what we value, and in the process to critically assess what seems unquestionable about how we organize society, how individuals in society relate to each other, and what they want from each other and how they treat each other. So as you listen tonight, I want you really to open your minds to the question, what if? What if the impossible is possible, if only we have the moral courage to achieve it? It takes courage to believe the world could be different. It takes humility to question whether, at the most fundamental levels, our most entrenched values and worldviews might need tweaking every once in a while. It takes imagination and creativity to envision a society that operates on the basis of care and concern rather than self-interest and self-preservation. Impossible, idealistic, impractical. These are concepts that keep us in our place. But the impossible can and has become possible. Ideals motivate whole movements. And the charge of impracticality may just be a justification for keeping a status quo that benefits some rather than others. It was once considered impractical to allow women to vote or pursue higher education at schools like this one. Women couldn't make independent decisions, weren't considered rational or intelligent enough to do so. Why educate women when their natural role and disposition isn't made for these things? Impractical. But look around your room or this room or the room that you're in. What do you see? The result of people getting together and asking, even demanding, what if? What if we could view women as equals in society? What if women's voices and perspectives are valuable and important to the public discourse? What if we educated them? It took a lot of work, challenging really long and firmly held views about who we are and how the world works to be able to claim these spaces, political and educational. But as you all embark on your dreams and enter into your adulthoods, think about the world that you live in as opposed to a world where beliefs limiting women's access to education and politics held sway. Many of you wouldn't be here. It's not just scientific advances or legal precedents that can change. We can ask what if with respect to our values, how we structure society and what we believe about each other. Dr. Martin Luther King imagined a day where human beings would not be judged by the color of their skin, but for the content of their character. He had the audacity to challenge a widely held belief system about who mattered in society. And yes, we still talk about race and racism because we still have work to do on that front. But what we know is that when he spoke those words, many people rejected his statement outright. While now, for the most part, we recognize it as a truth, an ideal that guides us and for which to strive. That's progress, not perfection, but progress. Having the dream, imagining a different world, is the first step. Revolutionary love is asking us to do the same, to imagine a different society, one that places love and care at its center. Lerner is asking the question, what if? He's presenting a vision of how politics could be different and elaborating shifts in our consciousness necessary to make this happen. He's endorsing the idea that we can deprogram ourselves from thinking that there is no other way, and that we are stuck with the choices that we have. His is a politics of hope, a progressive in the sense of believing that transformation to a better world is possible, and the belief that change is necessary. As I've said, Lerner's ideas of revolution is value focused, and this is exactly what we say at Alvernia, that our vocation is more than a career. It's a calling, that we should be guided by spiritual values, core values, and that knowledge should be joined with love. In what follows, I will present the ways that revolutionary love can be linked to Alvernia's core values: contemplation, humility, peacemaking, collegiality, and service. What needs to change is the question. Lerner presents us with a beautiful, if saddening, thought. It was one that really resonated with me while thinking back through the last year and a half, isolated from loved ones, disconnected from community, and the gifts that come from these moments where we express our hopes and dreams together. It's the idea of spiritual well-being and what Lerner calls the great spiritual deprivation. He writes early on in the book that part of the problem and failure of politics is that politics is based on what he calls the materialist reduction misconception. Now, what he means by this is that the tendency to see problems and people in terms of material needs and money, which has plagued past political movements, both left and right, whether it be privileging the priorities of the wealthy, mistakenly assuming that the workers' complaints are solely economic, or assuming that securing economic security or material gains and needs is always the primary goal. For Lerner, a politics of hope, one that moves beyond politics of the present, must recognize that there's a human yearning for a higher purpose, deeper meaning that is present and needs to be tapped into, addressed and honored, what he calls the great yearning. In other words, contemplation is central to our being. As a core value, contemplation exists as a mode of connection with our inner self, our purpose, our spiritual center, as well as cultivating an appreciation for the awe of creation, to be inspired by nature, to imagine how we might better utilize our talents, and to reflect upon our place in the world and how we might change it. Contemplation calls us to consider how we are both individual and part of something larger and greater. And it obligates us to strive for a greater good, aspiring towards humanity, to be humane, sometimes over and against all of our all too human tendencies for pure self-fulfillment or self-interest. It's within this context that we can understand Lerner's critique of capitalism. Lerner asks us to consider how a society that is organized most rigidly around economic value and profit has, inadvertently or not, led to some particularly problematic characteristics, such as greed and selfishness, which hinder our ability to express compassion for our fellow human beings and to find inner sustenance that yields both self-love and love of others. Economic anthropologist Dr. Jason Hickel strikes at the heart of the psychological effects with this quote: "We are depressed, lonely, and alienated society because we live in an economic system that is organized around artificial scarcity, exploitation, and extraction. It breaks us every day. It breaks us every day." Lerner is proposing that we adjust our hierarchy of valuation. Instead of placing money and profit at the apex of society, where our success as individuals and communal success is judged by wealth and acquisition, and yes, even our moral status is conferred by these, that we place care and love at its apex as the signs of success, as what gives us our worth, where we find merit. Lerner points out that an alternative to capitalist values is needed if we're going to address the ills of the world. And this is not all that new. It's what St. Francis was doing. Francis was the son of an affluent merchant family, born during the time of significant social and economic and political change, marked by a rising middle class, the shift towards currency-based economy, and constant wars with rival city-states. He grew highly dissatisfied with the growing worldliness, we could say materialism, political strife, and social and economic injustice around him, particularly in relation to the plights of the poor and the suffering, and those suffering with leprosy in particular. Those who were outcast from society and seen to have no value. He spoke out against materialism, the worship of profit and money. He practiced a vow of poverty to show that there were higher ideals that should guide us as a society, and that community must be built on love, empathy, and concern for each other. So when Lerner talks about how we're trapped in an ideology of the marketplace and that we've forgotten that the system and value, that this system and values can be challenged, he's spreading the same message of hope and transformation as St. Francis. The belief that things can be different and that society can be grounded on spiritual values, not profit alone. This is what Lerner means by spiritual socialism. It's a social focus on the spiritual, on developing and celebrating our inner being, our ability to contemplate our higher purpose, to express reverence and awe for our most common humanity, and formulate hopes and dreams that speak to our inner needs as much as the outward trappings of success. Lerner's plea is for us to reorient our value system by globalizing generosity, empathy, and love. And this is aligned with St. Francis's vision, the vision handed down to us here at Alvernia University. Now, Lerner does call out entities in power, elites, and the corporate system as forces that perpetuate the myths of the inevitability of human selfishness and competitiveness, and that economic measures of success are the only ones that work. These are myths that he thinks turn people against people. He talks about how regular people, you and I, all of us, have been encouraged to blame anything but the system itself, to blame any hardship or lack of monetary success on ourselves, our moral failings, or on others. This is how anger, psychological discouragement, and divisiveness take root, dividing us from each other. This is why Lerner entreats us to understand how all forms of oppression support an overarching system which maintains sovereignty and power by pitting differences against differences, and that cultivating empathy for each other and addressing intersectional disparities is the path forward. Healing through humility. How we address each other is where this all starts. Lerner talks about the fact that many who have been taken in by the politics of hatred are just fed up with politics, and they don't see either party as caring about them. They feel left behind by the left, who are only concerned with special interests, and the old right, which seems to favor the rich, and some elements of the far right today, which have been linked to destructive rhetoric of hate and white supremacy. Appealing to psychology, Lerner suggests that imagining a different world, moving beyond our present politics, beyond both left and right politics, but beyond this partisanship that we see so prevalent today, begins with acknowledging the pain that people feel, the hidden injuries of class, the feelings of self-blame that are generated by the equation of money and success. and the feelings of being discounted and belittled by those who have different views, often expressed with superiority and disdain. Lerner reminds us that how things are going is rarely solely determined by material fact. We are not rational automatons, but affective, emotional beings motivated by fear, love, and all sorts of things in between. And we must cultivate empathy and understanding for why people express fear and anger and move to a place where we acknowledge each other's common dignity and humanity, to be humane. In other words, healing begins through humility. None are above the other. When we realize that much of the disillusionment and anger expressed by those with whom we disagree comes from a common place, we may begin to forge alliance and move in solidarity with our fellow humans. This is what Lerner means by a socialism of the heart. As Elizabeth Boyd, senior lecturer for the School of Arts and Humanities at Edith Cowan University, has written, our dreams take us from small acts of empathy to noble visions of equality and justice. The act of humility is the bridge. It's a bridge building tool that paves the way for joining common cause. Humility is also a kind of self-love. To not internalize the hatred that we see around us, we must have enough humility to make changes to ourselves, to hold ourselves accountable. Lerner's ultimate goal is to promote what he calls the caring society. And he outlines the shift in economic and systemic imperatives upon which it will be based. First and foremost, it takes humility and empathy to shift away from our tone deafness to each other. It also requires transforming what he calls the bottom line. Mentally, what's in it for me? What's the payout? How is this or that measure profitable? Unless we change the bottom line thinking that we naturally sort of gravitate towards, we're always going to be chasing measures of success that only support materialist values, which leave many economically and spiritually disenfranchised. But more than this, it requires taking a hard look at our actions and policies as a society. In my mind, this is where peacemaking comes in. Peacemaking, or staying with the trouble. As my good friend and colleague, Dr. Kevin Godfrey, insists, peacemaking in the Franciscan tradition is not about shying away from conflict or hard discussions. It's not just about being peaceful. It's about going to where the trouble is, having a difficult discussion primarily where we do disagree, and making choices that resist being mere placations. Peacemaking also means having the courage to confront past wrongs with wide open eyes, rather than doubling down and denying their existence. There's nothing wrong with identifying with either the left or the right and taking a stand for what you believe. But we can't do so by ignoring the unsavory elements which have crept into our politics. There are issues in society today that should be called out. As Lerner says, no politics should support hate, violence, belittling behavior, or denigration of others. Acknowledgement of our complicity in partisanship and reconciling past mistakes, as well as the necessity of taking responsibility as a Western society for many of the global ills and exploitations of capitalism, are thus related to peacemaking. As Cheryl Garcia writes, peacemaking is intentional, sustained, the replacement of negative emotion with positive action. It is intentionally deferring to the needs of others. Through this deference, peacemaking is a redemptive act for both the giver and the receiver, and becomes a circular process of relationship building. What it is not, remaining silent in the face of disagreement or tolerant in the face of cruelty and injustice. Alvernia's core value of peacemaking is a crucial transformative tool at our disposal. So I know that many of you are going to be or might be nonplussed with my focus on values. It's all fine and good to espouse ideals, but you've given me no practical solutions, Dr. Schultz. And yes, Lerner does offer some very specific policies and goals for changing our economic system, for shifting our policy in the direction of sustainable resources and climate control, for ensuring democratic participation through an equal rights amendment, promoting worker-owned businesses, holding nations and corporations accountable for the depletion of resources, moving away from profit motive in healthcare, and reforming education in order to focus on service and civic engagement, rewarding the ability and desire to care for the planet and each other, and addressing economic and social inequality. What I would say is this: we can disagree about the how or the what of policies that should exist, but it's much more difficult to deny the why of this book, that our world deserves better. And it's for this reason, merely rejecting the ideas brought forward by Lerner isn't enough. If we acknowledge that the world, our world, could be a better place, that there are problems to be solved, it's our obligation to do better than refusal. It's incumbent upon us all to continue to ask, what if, and to seek out other solutions. But I don't believe this is really a book about policy, per se. It's a book about beginnings, about what is necessary to embark on change in the first place. Many of the changes Lerner recommends are spiritual in nature, fostering the obligation to care as a societal ethos, for instance, for which Lerner draws upon the feminist tradition of care ethics. The transformation in social consciousness requires asking the hard question of why the values of care and compassion seem so far away, so idealistic, so unattainable, and also why they are seen as often weak, ineffective, impractical. It's also asking the question of why, as Joan Tronto's research has shown, a care ethicist, economically speaking, quote, care activities are devalued, underpaid, and disproportionately occupied by the relatively powerless in society. We have only to look at the contemporary rhetoric in our society today to see how love and care are denigrated. Identifying with social justice makes one as SJW. And by the way, that's not used positively. You can be a snowflake, you're too sensitive, you're a cuck, which means to be emasculated or too effeminate, a crybaby, a whiner. Doesn't this just reinforce the point that values associated with care and concern have been denigrated in our society today? One of my students asked the question, and it was brilliant. When and how did we lose our ability to be concerned and to care? Why? Why do expressing love to others and attempting to infuse our assessment of political and social problems with compassion make one weak? Contrastingly, why do we often see valorization of the opposite, associating justice with might, with those who can impose their will, speak the loudest, be the most dispassionate and insensitive as signs of superiority? When love and compassion are seen as countercultural values, we have a problem. I can tell you one reason for this as a feminist scholar. These values have been typically seen as unmasculine or effeminate or womanly. And because of past associations with the feminine, as have been seen as less valuable and less important in the public and social spheres. Those are for the private realm, right? Better left in the home and not fit for hard, rational, and intellectual realities of politics. Care ethicists have begun to challenge this paradigm. recognizing that care as a foundation for ethics is equally valid to traditional methods of ethical contemplation. Even arguing that the absence of values of care, empathy, and compassion from traditional ethical accounts has left a gigantic hole in our ability to foresee the paths and obstacles required for attaining a complete and full humanity. There is no grand rift between theory and practice, between shifting because shifting our consciousness, our understanding of what is valuable, what is possible, and transforming the heart and spirit are necessary precursors for any real change. I believe this with all my heart and soul. It reminds me of Audre Lorde's famous and powerful statement, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." We may live in a pragmatic world, one focused on productivity, material indices of progress, and practical solutions. But the tools we need to transform our world be of a different nature. I often think about what the philosopher David Hume says about the possibility of morality as such. Essentially, he says that we can know with our mind what is right. We can formulate and suggest principles of action and new policies, but unless we attend to what motivates us to act, our passions, our heart, these are merely empty principles that look good on paper. Attending to our spiritual lives, transforming our values is practical. In fact, it's revolutionary. We can begin to see the caring society as a real possibility by thinking about Alvernia's core values of collegiality and service. You all have hopefully witnessed through your service projects, through the bonds you've formed here, and through Alvernia's commitment to public outreach, the transformative nature of these values when it comes to community building. Whereas the model for many of our relationships is based on terms of exchange, competition, and domination, care ethics argues for adopting a more compassionate basis for human interactions. Excuse me. It starts with collegiality, respecting and cultivating the interpersonal realm where we begin to experience close bonds with others. According to care ethicists, caring is a fundamental impulse for us humans. From infancy onwards, we all have the experience of needing each other, of desiring love and companionship. This natural inclination to care, born out of love or closeness to our immediate others, can be used as a model to develop ethical caring. Key Enlightenment thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau also believed that compassion was one of the fundamental natural passions, one that extended from our desire to affect the world and our self-love. For Rousseau, compassion isn't against self-interest or individualism, but instead an enhancement and an expansion of it. As we have to extend ourselves and express our power by turning towards others, the power of love, the strength of love. In other words, he links the self-love expressed in compassion to the collegial, community-oriented spirit, rather than seeing self-love as always devolving into individualistic self-interest. I'd like you to think about the various critical moments in this book along this vein, not as a complete rejection of individualism, of the politics, of rights, of capitalism, but as an opportunity to reflect on the implications of focusing on certain aspects of our nature at the expense of others, and how a certain kind of value and vision of success, of rightness, of reality takes hold within us and makes it difficult to express other importantly and socially valuable values. Lerner's point, derived directly from Care Ethics Playbook, actually, is a simple one. Making the societal decision to value care and love changes the decisions we make about how we structure society. Instead of seeing the corporate sector and military strength or government and law as the most important segments of society deserving the highest level of wealth and power, a caring society might see the task of bringing up children, educating its members, meeting the needs of all, achieving peace, and treasuring the environment, and doing these in the best possible way to be the greatest, where we should put our greatest social efforts and devote our money. In care ethics, cultivating community and being sensitive to the particularity of others become grounding principles, and reciprocal commitment to each other's well-being becomes both an ethical priority and a political goal. Most importantly, responsiveness to the needs of others requires the understanding that to be responsive, one must understand the reality of the cared for. We must develop empathy for what the cared for is experiencing. This is the essence of Alvernia's model of service and service learning. Service strengthens our capacity to know, compassion, and deepens our insight. Some say there's no place for empathy or compassion in politics, but we've seen the results of this. The inability to understand the perspectives of others, the increase in racial divides, partisanship, hateful epithets towards those who don't follow the same path. Empathy is about understanding. Let's make policy based on that foundation. A caring society is one that respects the dignity of others and sees them as ends in themselves, fosters the ability to find deep satisfaction in our own inner lives and our connection with and care for other human beings, animals, and the world, and sees the earth and the universe not just as resources to satisfy human needs, but as an amazing living reality of which we are a part. Feminist and political activist Bell Hooks has long proposed an ethic of love as a means by which we might be guided to turn away from an ethic of domination. As she says, liberation is rudderless without love, and it must be the guiding value that shapes our political vision, because love gives us the capacity to expand who and what we care about and to create bonds of solidarity. It is the embrace of Lerner's first principle. Every person deserves to be respected and cared for. The main point I want to leave you with is this: love is not weak. It is the cause of our most powerful bonds, and through it, we become a stronger community, which can stand up to forces that embattle us. It takes strength to respond with kindness, courage to express compassion. As African-American theologian Howard Thurman believed, we best learn love as the practice of freedom and in the context of community. And as Martin Luther King, the great advocate of love as a transformative social force, believed, power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love. The new bottom line is this: rather than measuring success solely in terms of profit, let's measure success on the degree to which we promote and support human well-being. Let's make love our highest value. And let's remember that Alvernia's core values are values of love, revolutionary love. Thank you. All right, so
a chance for questions and answers.
That's right.
So, we do have a question actually from the YouTube live stream. It states, was Lerner more biased towards a political side in his writing?
Sure. So the term bias is a really tricky one, right? So a lot of times we talk about bias and we mean sort of unconscious biases that we have come to sort of gravitate to certain values and beliefs and we're not aware of them, or that we may be influenced by certain ideas and cultural influences that we're not considering. I think one can say Lerner is definitely coming from a particular perspective, right? And he is upfront about that. He's a rabbi. He's an old-timey political activist, right? He was fighting this in the civil rights movement. He was, pretty upfront about that. And, I think that he's definitely really interested in historically, where did those movements go wrong? Why have they not been and not to say that they've been completely unsuccessful, right? But why haven't they continued or been as powerful or been as dynamic as they could be? And so in that case, he is speaking to I think the left in a particular way, right? To progressives who, and saying, look, there's stuff that went wrong, and you can't stay, you have to be honest with where those things went wrong and why it is that you're having such trouble reaching across the aisle and being able to get commitment for things that, quite honestly, let's be honest, right? The idea that we should all be equal, the idea of civil rights, the idea of the women's movement and equal rights for women and men, those are not controversial things, right? Right? The idea that we can do better as a society, that, that we should address climate issues and that we should take care of our environment. These are sort of, issues that the left does take up in a certain way. And why aren't these things, where's the disconnect in the message, right? I think that he does see, and his criticism of the right is very different. And it may be rightly said that, he is less familiar and even though he tries to be sympathetic and to what might be going on, I think this is a book about beginnings. As I said, he's saying we need to actually practice a kind of healing and humility. We have to actually understand what our opponents, if you want to even call them that, right? What the different sides believe and why, where the anger is coming from. What I think where I think that he is critical of the right, it's a very particular set of issues and a very particular way that certain groups and certain practices have oriented or gravitated towards the right, right? So it is the case, whether this is what you want to say is indicative of the values of the right or not, that in our very contemporary framework, white supremacists, right, have taken up and sort of gravitated to a particular kind of radical right rhetoric. Now, I don't think, and this may be where he could do a better job of the way that he articulates his points of view, I don't think that he's associating everyone who is a conservative with those positions. But I absolutely do think, and I think it's a fair assessment to say that there is a disturbing conjunction between some very violent, hateful rhetoric and speech that have, for right or wrong, have identified with the current politics of the right, right? And so if that is what you mean by he's more biased to one side than another, I would prefer to say, to sort of maybe not reduce it to just bias, because we can't have a discussion if it's just, well, this is just bias and there's no reason for it. I think just like with what Lerner is asking of us, we have to understand why would Lerner and how has he formed the opinion, right, that there is something to be criticized on both the left and the right.
Another viewer asked, what if us college kids had the power to change the world and make the world better, but we weren't trusted with the power because we were only college kids?
Oh my goodness. So I hope that that was, yes.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. What if us college kids had the power to change the world and make the world better, but we were entrusted with the power because we were only college kids.
Thank you.
Yeah, so it's interesting. One of my frustrations about the way that our public discourse is working right now is that the opinions and the reactions of the youth, right? You all are in many senses dismissed, right? And I don't know. I have some perhaps hypotheses that I'm not really haven't fully formulated about this, about why, but we do see it, and it must be frustrating for you all, right? The idea that, oh well, whatever happens on college campuses, it's sort of, it's just overblown. They're just, too sensitive. They don't really know what's happening. I actually trust you more than that. And I think that you will find there are a lot of people who actually are placing our hope in you and what you all are going to do in this world. And so if you feel disempowered, you're absolutely entitled to that feeling. I think it's justified. I think there are messages that are actually being, given to you in our society today that suggest, that, let the adults do it, right? But I wouldn't be a professor. I wouldn't have devoted my life to education and to constantly on a daily basis choosing to be in a room with all of you if I didn't think that solution and the power to make these changes actually lies with you. And so I think speak up, right? One of the things that we try to do through the search program at Alvernia and the mission of Alvernia is to really help cultivate your awareness of the spheres of existence that go and may stem and sort of they start with you and what you believe, but they go outwards to your communities, to your families, to your society, to culture, and then, seriously, to the globe and to the universe, right? In order to make change, in order to be the change agents and to be empowered, you have to become engaged in the world and aware and to ask the hard questions, to use peacemaking to go to where the trouble is, right? So the youth and college students, you have all the tools and you're learning the tools to do that. It is, though, a choice, right, that you have to make about whether you're going to take those tools up, how much of yourself you are going to devote to that kind of work. And then I think you do have the power.
Would you like a question from here, or would you like?
I actually have a question. So one of the so we have a sort of live audience of several of the classes to help support me, and thank you for being here, by the way, doing that, because your faces and your interest actually it's contagious, and it really makes the space what it is. So I appreciate that. And so one of the classes actually developed a set of questions ahead of time, which is nice. And I want to answer one of them, and then we can move to more from our YouTube live audience. And I find this question, first of all, the questions are just fantastic. You all give me hope because you are so smart and so interesting. But this is one that I think it's a fair question, and it's rather simple, right? So it's this: why is the author, Lerner, so radical with his ideas on how to change society? Yeah. And some of you, this may be how you were feeling. Oh my God, maybe I can get on board with the whole love, compassion thing, but the policies, they're bonkers, they're wacko, they're out there, right? So I wanted to address it because, you have to address the hard questions. You can't just, take the easy ones. And I was thinking about it, and I'm thinking about it in a couple ways. So there are a couple ways as philosophers tend to do. We complicate the discussion by by exploring the different aspects of the concept itself, right? So first of all, why are the solutions so radical? One way of answering that question is say, because the problems are so radical. Wealth inequality is at the highest levels beyond 1929, the Great Depression. We're actually verging on wealth inequality levels that existed prior to the French Revolution. And you know what happened there, right? That was a big problem. Social divisiveness is at a level, this sort of rhetoric of sort of it's very disturbing, right? There's been a sharp increase in hate crimes against minorities, the climate crisis, the fact that we keep having more and more natural disasters that are related to climate issues, right? We do live in a time that deserves radical solutions. But another way of answering this is to actually say they're not that radical. Now, you all may be like, what? What are you talking about, Dr. Schultz? I mean, like, this stuff is way out in left field. It's never going to happen, right? But a lot of what he's proposing, or some of the things he's proposing, already exist in a kind of nascent form. So I don't know if that you know this, but so in 1998, the government of Bhutan developed and proposed a gross national happiness index. And their society actually measures the nation's success on the basis of spiritual, physical, social, and environmental health. That sounds really familiar, right? Of its citizens, not just its citizens, but also of the natural environment. This is an index that exists. And by the way, it was proposed to the United Nations or some global body. I'm not sure if I got that right. And it has been taken up. And now many developing countries also use the gross national happiness index in their own countries, right? So that's not that radical. If it exists already, it can't be, right? The idea of universal health care, or education as something that we support as a nation. Actually, the United States is way far behind most of the developing nations on that particular issue. It's not radical. It's not radical elsewhere, right? So the U.S. is an outlier in some of these situations, some of these things. So they may sound radical because we're really familiar with, and we are immersed in the environment that we live in, right? But they're not so radical. Now, even the idea, and some of my students actually mentioned this, of sort of mandatory civil service. That sounds radical. It's absolutely not something we have here, right? But other countries actually do. And it works quite well for them. It doesn't mean that everybody has to go to war. It doesn't mean everybody has to be in the military. But the idea that we actually inculcate in the youth a sort of understanding of the value of citizenship and service on a societal national level, also not that radical. The final thing I'll say is this. What does radical really mean, right? So radical also means root, right? And in the feminist movement, the idea of radical is actually embraced because it's about getting to root causes, which is exactly what Lerner is saying. Remember that I said the quote by Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. What that means is that one has to actually root out and think about the fundamental values that need to be changed. So it's not just about individual perspectives. It's not just about left versus right, but it's about the whole system and the framework through which we understand and through which we understand ourselves as citizens and as a society. And so radical means analyzing those root causes and root values. And that is absolutely a positive aspect of this book in my mind. We should all want to really consider and be aware of the values that really motivate and animate our understanding of the world. So that's my answer to that question.
So another question from one of our viewers briefly is, what was the definition of love again in the political aspect from your standpoint?
What is the definition of love from the political standpoint? So it's. So I don't know that I ever actually defined, and that's a first for a philosopher, right? I didn't ever really specifically define love, but I think that one could glean that from Lerner's position and from what I said in this talk, that love has to be a communal fellow feeling, a kind of connection, a reaching out beyond, expansion beyond the self, towards and with the intent of caring for another person or another entity like the environment, right? So it's about connection, it's about community, and it's about care. And I think therein lies the political aspect. So Bell Hooks says, when in her work, she's written several books on the ethic of love and the importance of love for politics, that love is a countermeasure to domination and oppression that has existed historically. Bell Hooks is a Black feminist, and so she's very much interested in how do Black individuals in our society, how do they address and cope with that history that is painful, and it's absolutely devastating, right? And she uses the value of love as a way of healing, as the way that members of that community can become one community, can find solidarity with each other and find strength. So love, politically speaking, produces solidarity and a way to address and to combat without just anger and devastation those forces that are contrary to love.
Another question, and this one actually I think relates to what you just said. The premise of the book rests on the assumption that all people are naturally good and we have been made selfish. What if humans are naturally selfish? How will we restrain this in a caring society?
So that's an excellent question, and it's interesting because within our own political history, so we have figures of the classical political modern political tradition that actually held exactly these opposing views. So Thomas Hobbes says human beings are selfish. They're self-interested and left to their own devices and their ultimate freedom. The state of nature will be a nasty, brutish place, right? Because we can't control ourselves. We need a sovereign. And we will rationally come to the understanding that we need someone to be in some kind of system that has power to rein us in, right? Now, on the opposite, also part of the social contract tradition that we've taken up as sort of like a fundamental aspect of our democratic process, right, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? And Rousseau actually says human beings are fundamentally good, right? We are compassionate. We actually show this in, the ways that we have a natural, well, he doesn't say this, but I would say, I would connect to care ethics, the way we have a natural inclination to both show concern and care for our offspring, right? And that it's society and the civilization has kind of corrupted. And so that's sort of the 2 points. I think this book has had enough of the first option. And I think that Lerner is saying, we already followed that path and we assumed and have been told that, yeah, you know what? We are just self-interested. We're greedy, we're selfish, we're egoistic, and we should base politics on the fact that, hey, rationally speaking, we've got to have something that works in the self-interest of everyone, and it's always a competition, right? And I think he would say, look where that's gotten us, right? Is it the case that that's actually true and that's really the nature of human beings? Or is it that that's the position and the framework through which we decided to look at politics, and then we've gotten so mired in it that myth has become a reality for us, right? I tend to think that this is where care ethics, which is a very developed area of research and scholarship and theory, really is a good helpmate for that, because it gives us examples of how care is something that we can all relate to, and that we have felt the need for, that we actually come into this world as dependent, not just independent, isolated, self-interested, egoistic beings who are rationally calculating our next move, but our fundamental and our first experiences are connected, right? Even anthropologists are revising some of the kinds of ways they're looking at societies that actually, and I think it was Margaret Mead or someone was asked, what's the first sign of civilization? And she didn't say weapons or tools. And if it's not Margaret Mead, I'm so sorry. But whoever it was said a mended bone. A mended bone. Why? Because it meant that human beings cared enough about their fellow human being who was injured, not to just leave them to get devoured or to leave them to the elements, right? That's care. That's compassion. I just don't believe that that is not a part of our nature. And yes, we also have parts of our nature that are self-interested, that are competitive. But to suggest that those are the only things that we have to capitulate to those, as opposed to countering them with some of the more higher-minded aspects of our human being, I think is to give up. And that's my answer to that.
Another viewer asks, Lerner has stated on several occasions that he demands change and declares that we as humans should take a stand. How is that possible with his lack of providing suggestions to achieve these goals?
Okay. So I would sort of question the question, I guess, because I think the second half of the book is filled with actual suggestions, some of which are very forward-thinking, high-minded, or maybe sort of future-oriented and may be less difficult to implement immediately, some of which are not, right? And so I think that he actually does give several very specific policy suggestions. I mentioned some of them. I think the idea, so we were talking about this in my class, the idea of, and this would appeal maybe to you all, right, of tying or tethering college admission to more than just SATs and statistics and quantifiable stuff, but to tie it to the potential and desire of students to do good in the world and to have some kind of civic orientation. Is actually really not that far from, it's something that's already, I think, already becoming a part of admission process, right? Maybe not in all schools, but there are a lot of schools that are moving away from SAT alone. There are a lot of schools that are recognizing that students or potential students, they're more than just a number. I mean, don't we all want to be considered more than just a number, right? That there are talents and value that students have that can be displayed in different ways. So maybe it's through the essay that you write, through your community service elements. So I think that some of the things like that are not too far off. I think I've given an example of how the idea of rewarding the focus on well-being, and even on the sustainability of the environment, are already being measured, and in some societies to a larger degree, have become priorities that have become seen as how they bestow value and merit, right? So again, I don't know that he doesn't give, he does give specific policies, and I don't think that some of them are as radical or impractical as perhaps a quick or cursory glance might suggest or might imply.
Another question, as a Catholic university, in regards to Lerner's views on overpopulation, how would our school's values reconcile with this, as they seem to be opposing views?
Oh my goodness. So I knew there was going to be that one question which actually addressed the specifics of an issue that I did not review immediately prior to this talk. And that is actually the one. I will say that I am blanking a little bit on the exact proposal related to overpopulation. And I would prefer perhaps to maybe do a little bit of research and get back to that student. Because I don't feel that, as comfortable having a response. I would, yeah, that's, I apologize.
None of you said you keep up bringing Rousseau.
Oh.
He was pro-freedom and anti-government. You support a man, Lerner, that wants to give the government total control.
Okay, well, I don't think Rousseau was anti-government. Actually, he was very critical of the particular historical situation and his government, right? But Rousseau was also one of, he wrote about the general will and the common good, and he was a social contract theorist along with Hobbes and Locke. And so he was actually pro-government that was actually created through social contract, and that gave a voice to those citizens and those involved in society. So he actually did not see freedom and the social good as being contradictory concepts. And I think that actually a little bit more Rousseau in our own political thinking would be a great idea.
How do basic matters of human rights like women's suffrage and civil rights compare to radical ideas like socialism?
Oh, okay. So I think one thing is when, so the way that the question is worded, radical ideas like socialism, leads me to believe that I would need to know a little bit more about what this particular author of the question actually thinks about socialism and how they understand it. Whenever I've used the term socialism, I was very careful to qualify how I was understanding it in the sense of, like I said, a socialism of the heart, et cetera, but as a focus on the social. And I know that perhaps some of Lerner's policies, he even says, are closer to socialism. But so I'll leave that part, the radical idea of socialism, for a moment. I would say that within both the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, there were support that was given from socialist movements to those movements, and that there were obviously not all parts of the feminist movement or all parts of the civil rights movement, but that there was actually quite a bit of support between a form of between socialist movements and feminism and civil rights. I know that's not sort of necessarily an adequate answer, but I think that's as far as I can go with that, really.
There have been several comments that have indicated that people perceive that Lerner and perhaps even some elements of what you've shared with us sound like communism, or that maybe it's more like Marxism.
Oh my goodness.
And I was just wondering if you wouldn't mind responding to that claim.
Oh my goodness. So I really don't know if I'm up to the task of having a sort of a delineating the differences between socialism, communism, different types of what is sort of is the sort of general rhetoric surrounding communism, what Marx meant, and his form of communism, etc. I don't think that the idea of shifting the values or starting to value love and compassion and care as a societal norm has anything or necessarily anything to do with communism. And I don't know how one would get from one to the other. In fact, I would say this. The idea of communism, which is a kind of radical egalitarianism, right? When Lerner talks about valuing and shifting what we consider valuable or the measures of success towards things like how well we account for and enrich human well-being, or how well we care for others. It's actually establishing a new measure by which we actually can award and merit others. So there is actually a sort of a way of it's still a measure of success that actually implies that there can be ways to reward the value and the actions of society members in different ways. It's not sort of just a sort of radical egalitarianism where everyone deserves the exact same thing, which is, I think, what people mean when they talk about communism today, right? That everyone's going to get the exact same thing, that there is no ability for people to succeed, that there's no competition, and so there's not going to be any way to bestow honors or values upon people, that is just going to be sort of this sort of like everybody gets the same thing. We're all in the same breadline. I think that's sort of like the view of communism, right? And I don't think that's what we have in Lerner. He's actually giving us a new model by which we figure out what people deserve. We want to reward people who actually produce and enhance well-being in society, right? And that's the reward rather than just producing wealth and profit. Those are some hard questions.
And from our audience, are there some questions or comments that you would like to share?
Comments are welcome too.
Absolutely.
Yes.
One question I just had is, I think it's always a debate about whether people are trained to be selfish or born selfish, but I feel like a lot of the ideas that Lerner brings up, I don't know, I think they're really nice ideas to think about and nice to put out there, but how realistic do you think this could actually be implemented into our society?
Well, I like that question because I will take you back to Germs. There have always been moments in our history where things that exist now, right, didn't exist, where people said, oh, that's impossible, right? I also take you back to my discussion of women's suffrage and education, right? There's a time where that was considered impractical, that was considered beyond the pale, right? Women, why they're not going to go, to university. Why would we want them to vote? They don't have, the sort of capabilities, the rational sort of capacity. They're going to do what their husbands tell them to do anyway. That was the widely held view for a long time, right? It's not. In fact, can you even imagine it today? Look at all of you in this room, right? So the idea that these, love and care they're really nice concepts, but is it really practical? Or, it's just, I can't even imagine it. That is the stumbling block. And that was why I started this talk in the way that I did, because if we can't actually become, capable of envisioning something different, if we can't actually strive to move beyond the possible, what is in front of us, the way the system is towards it changing, then we won't ever get anywhere. And that's part of the problem, right? So do I believe that it's possible? Absolutely. Do I believe that it's going to happen like that? Or no, not at all. But look, we're having this conversation, right? You all are introduced to these ideas now, for better or for worse, but now you have more tools at your disposal to have discussions and articulate your point of view, even if you disagree with some of the points of view that are in Lerner's book, right? But to have a discussion where you're, entreated to say, look, how we structure society, that is something that is not essential and a done deal for all times, because we can see in the past that that's not the way that the world works, right? We've made huge strides. And so that becomes now, I hate to say this, so some people say ignorance is bliss, right? But now y'all are not, right? Now you're aware, right? And now it's up to you. It's your responsibilities to go out there and figure out what needs to change, and how to shift the framework, what to transform, and, to aspire to envision a different future. Because it is absolutely just not the case that things that were once considered impossible aren't possible now, right? Change happens. And, we have only to look at historical precedents to see that. So I would say that the idea that this is just idealistic sort of blather or whatever, I think that is a stumbling block. It's an obstacle that we have to overcome. But thank you I love that ending on that question, because it sort of really puts the focus back on what we're doing here at Alvernia. The idea of being change makers, that ethics is not just about being a good person. It's about making change in the world. Right. And that's what we're teaching and hopefully inculcating in you, that belief and that dream. Thank you.